Part 5, Economic Miracles and New Tensions, 1979 to 2001. Friends, did you know that in just a few decades, China went from a poor, isolated country to the world's factory floor, and the United States played a key role in making it happen? But as fortunes rose, so did suspicions. How did a partnership built on hope and profit start to unravel into a new era of rivalry? Let's step into the late 1970s. China is emerging from the chaos of the Cultural Revolution. Its cities are poor, its people hungry for change. In 1978, a new leader, Deng Xiaoping, takes charge. He promises to open China to the world, to let some people get rich first, and to learn from the West. At the same time, the United States is looking for new markets and new allies. The Cold War is still on, but the US sees China as a potential partner against the Soviet Union and a vast, untapped market for American goods. In 1979, the US and China establish full diplomatic relations. Embassies open. Students, businesspeople, and tourists begin to travel between the two countries. The world is watching, and the possibilities seem endless. The real turning point comes in the 1980s. China launches a series of bold economic reforms. State-run farms are replaced by family plots. Special economic zones are set up along the coast, where foreign companies can invest and experiment with capitalism. American companies are among the first to arrive. They build factories, hire workers, and teach new skills. Trade between the US and China explodes, growing from just a few $1 billion a year to tens of billions. But not everyone is happy. In the US, some worry about lost jobs and unfair competition. In China, some fear that Western ideas will undermine the Communist Party's control. Tensions simmer beneath the surface. Then, in 1989, the world watches in shock as Chinese students gather in Tiananmen Square, demanding democracy and reform. The government responds with tanks and gunfire. The images of the crackdown are broadcast around the world, and the US imposes sanctions. The honeymoon is over. Let's break down the key events. 1978, Deng Xiaoping launches Reform and Opening Up. China begins to shift from a planned economy to a market-oriented one. 1979, the US and China establish full diplomatic relations. Trade and cultural exchanges begin to grow. 1980s, special economic zones are created in cities like Shenzhen. American and other foreign companies invest heavily. China's economy starts to boom. 1989, the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre. The US and other Western countries impose sanctions, but economic ties continue to deepen. 1990s, China becomes the world's fastest-growing economy. US companies move more manufacturing to China, attracted by cheap labor in huge markets. 2001, China joins the World Trade Organization, WTO, promising to open its markets and play by global trade rules. The US supports China's entry, hoping it will lead to more reform and cooperation. But what did all this mean for ordinary people? Imagine a young Chinese worker in the 1980s, leaving her rural village for a job in a new factory in Shenzhen. She works long hours, but for the first time, she can send money home, buy new clothes, and dream of a better future. Or picture an American factory worker in the Midwest, watching as his job is moved overseas. He hears about cheap Chinese goods and wonders what happened to the American dream. There are stories of hope and heartbreak. Chinese families rise out of poverty, their children go to college, and new cities spring up almost overnight. American consumers enjoy low prices, but some communities are left behind. And then, there's the moment in 1989, when the world sees a lone man standing in front of a tank in Tiananmen Square. For many, it's a symbol of courage and the cost of change. For others, it's a reminder that the US and China still see the world very differently. The consequences are profound. By the late 1990s, China is on its way to becoming the world's second-largest economy. The US and China are deeply intertwined trading partners, competitors, and sometimes uneasy friends. But the cracks are starting to show. American workers and politicians complain about lost jobs, trade deficits, and intellectual property theft. Chinese leaders worry about Western influence and the threat to their power. When China joins the WTO in 2001, hopes are high that it will become a responsible stakeholder in the global system. But some in the US fear that China is playing by its own rules, using openness to grow stronger while keeping tight control at home. So, what can we learn from this era of economic miracles and new tensions? Partnerships can bring incredible change, but they also bring new challenges. The US and China helped each other grow, but they also created new sources of conflict. The dreams of the 1980s and 1990s of a world made better by trade and cooperation are now mixed with anxiety and suspicion. For ordinary people, the story is personal. It's about jobs, families, and the hope for a better life. For leaders, it's about power, pride, and the struggle to shape the future. As we move into the 21st century, the rivalry is no longer just about history, it's about the world we live in today, and the choices we all must make. Part 6, Superpower Showdown: Trade, Technology, and Tensions, 2001 to 2020. Friends, did you know that in just 2 decades, China went from being called the world's factory to challenging the United States for global leadership in technology, military, and even space? The rivalry is no longer hidden, it's out in the open, shaping the world we all live in. How did we get here, and what does it mean for our future? Let's step into the 21st century. The world is more connected than ever. The internet is changing how we live, work, and think. China, now a member of the World Trade Organization, is growing at a breathtaking pace. Skyscrapers rise in Shanghai and Shenzhen. Millions are lifted out of poverty. Chinese students flood into American universities, and American companies make billions selling to Chinese consumers. But beneath the surface, the old anxieties remain. The US is still the world's largest economy and military power, but China is catching up fast. American leaders hope that trade and engagement will make China more open and democratic. Chinese leaders, meanwhile, are determined to restore their country's place at the center of the world on their own terms. The first cracks appear in the early 2000s. American companies complain about intellectual property theft and unfair trade practices. Chinese firms, often backed by the state, grow into global giants: Huawei, Alibaba, Tencent. The US accuses China of manipulating its currency, stealing technology, and using cyber attacks to gain an edge. Then, the 2008 global financial crisis hits. While the US and Europe struggle, China's economy keeps growing. For many in China, it's proof that their system works and that the West is in decline. By the 2010s, the rivalry is everywhere. The US pivots to Asia, strengthening alliances and military presence in the Pacific. China builds artificial islands in the South China Sea, claiming new territory and challenging American dominance. The two countries compete for influence in Africa, Latin America, and beyond. And then, the trade war begins. Let's break down the key events. 2001, China joins the WTO, promising to open its markets and play by global rules. 2008, the global financial crisis shakes the world. China launches a massive stimulus, keeping its economy growing while the West falters. 2012, Xi Jinping becomes China's leader, promising a Chinese dream of national rejuvenation and a more assertive foreign policy. 2013 to 2017, China launches the Belt and Road Initiative, investing in infrastructure across Asia, Africa, and Europe. The US grows wary of China's expanding influence. 2018, the US, under President Trump, imposes tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars of Chinese goods, accusing China of unfair trade practices. China retaliates. The trade war escalates, shaking global markets. 2019, the US bans Huawei from its networks, citing national security concerns. The battle for 5G technology becomes a new front in the rivalry. 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic erupts. The US and China blame each other for the crisis, and relations hit a new low. Accusations of misinformation, cyber attacks, and decoupling dominate the headlines. But what does all this mean for ordinary people? Imagine a Chinese engineer working at Huawei, proud to be part of a company that's leading the world in 5G technology. She reads about US sanctions and wonders if her job and her country's future are at risk. Or picture an American soybean farmer in Iowa, watching his Chinese tariffs cut off his biggest market. He wonders why a trade war halfway around the world is threatening his family's livelihood. There are stories of hope, too. Chinese students study in American universities, building friendships and dreams that cross borders. American tech companies hire brilliant minds from China, creating innovations that change the world. But there is also fear. Chinese parents worry about their children facing discrimination abroad. American workers fear losing jobs to automation and foreign competition. Both sides feel misunderstood, threatened, and sometimes betrayed. The consequences are profound and far-reaching. The trade war disrupts global supply chains, raising prices and uncertainty. Both countries pour billions into new technologies, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, green energy, each determined to lead the next industrial revolution. Diplomatic ties fray. Military tensions rise in the South China Sea and around Taiwan. The world watches nervously, wondering if the rivalry will lead to conflict or cooperation. Yet, even as the competition intensifies, the US and China remain deeply connected. Trade continues, students and tourists travel, and scientists collaborate on global challenges like climate change and pandemics. So, what can we learn from this era of superpower rivalry? Competition can drive progress, but it can also breed mistrust and fear. The US and China are locked in a struggle not just for power, but for the future of technology, of the global economy, of the very rules that shape our world. For ordinary people, the rivalry is both distant and deeply personal. It affects jobs, prices, opportunities, and even the air we breathe. For leaders, it's a test of vision, courage, and wisdom. As we look to the future, the choices made by the US and China will shape not just their own destinies, but the fate of the entire world. Part 7, Pandemic, Power, and the Battle for the Future, 2020 to 2024. Friends, did you know that the COVID-19 pandemic didn't just change our daily lives, it also pushed the rivalry between the United States and China to new and dangerous heights? In a world already divided, the crisis became a battleground for truth, technology, and the future of global leadership. Let's step into the year 2020. The world is suddenly gripped by a mysterious new virus. Wuhan, a city in central China, becomes the epicenter of a global pandemic. Borders close, economies shut down, and fear spreads faster than the virus itself. The United States and China, already locked in a trade war, now find themselves blaming each other for the crisis. American leaders accuse China of hiding the truth about the virus's origins. Chinese officials fire back, accusing the US of politicizing the pandemic and failing to protect its own people. But the rivalry goes far beyond words. It's a race for vaccines, for medical supplies, for influence over how the world responds to the greatest crisis in a generation. The pandemic becomes a new front in the US-China rivalry. Both countries rush to develop vaccines, each hoping to prove their system is superior. China sends masks and medical teams to countries in need, calling it mask diplomacy. The US, meanwhile, struggles with its own outbreak, but also leads in vaccine innovation and distribution. Misinformation spreads online. Conspiracy theories, accusations, and propaganda fill social media. Trust between the two superpowers sinks to new lows. At the same time, the tech war heats up. The US tightens restrictions on Chinese companies like Huawei and TikTok, citing national security. China accelerates its push for self-reliance in semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and green technology. Military tensions rise, too. The South China Sea sees more naval patrols and close encounters. Taiwan becomes a flashpoint, with both sides warning of red lines and unshakable commitments. Let's break down the key events. 2020, COVID-19 spreads worldwide. The US and China trade accusations over the virus's origins and response. Both countries race to develop and distribute vaccines. 2020 to 2021, the US imposes new sanctions on Chinese tech firms. China responds with its own restrictions and ramps up investment in homegrown technology. 2021, the Biden administration continues a tough stance on China, focusing on alliances with Europe and Asia to counter Chinese influence. 2022, Russia invades Ukraine. The world watches China's response closely. The US warns China against supporting Russia, while China calls for peace but strengthens its ties with Moscow. 2022 to 2023, the US passes the CHIPS Act, investing billions in domestic semiconductor production. China accelerates its own tech development, aiming for self-sufficiency. 2023 to 2024, tensions over Taiwan reach new highs. Both sides conduct military exercises, and the world fears a possible conflict. At the same time, climate change, pandemics, and economic instability force the US and China to cooperate, sometimes reluctantly, on global challenges. But what does all this mean for ordinary people? Imagine a Chinese scientist working around the clock to develop a COVID-19 vaccine, knowing the world is watching and judging her every move. She feels pride in her country's achievements, but also pressure from the government and the global spotlight. Or picture an American nurse in New York, overwhelmed by the pandemic's first wave. She hears politicians blaming China, but her focus is on saving lives, not politics. She wonders if the world will ever come together to fight a common enemy. There are stories of hope, too. Chinese and American scientists share data and research, racing to understand the virus. Students from both countries connect online, sharing their fears and dreams for a post-pandemic world. But there is also fear and anger. Asian Americans face a surge in hate crimes, blamed for a virus they had nothing to do with. Chinese citizens abroad worry about discrimination and suspicion. The rivalry, once distant, now touches lives in deeply personal ways. The consequences of these years are still unfolding. The pandemic exposes weaknesses in both systems: China's secrecy, America's political divisions. Both countries emerge more determined than ever to lead the world on their own terms. The tech war reshapes global supply chains. Countries around the world are forced to choose sides, or try to balance between the two giants. The risk of military conflict over Taiwan or the South China Sea remains real, even as both sides insist they want peace. Yet, the need for cooperation is undeniable. Climate change, pandemics, and economic crises do not respect borders. The US and China, for all their differences, must find ways to work together or risk dragging the world into chaos. So, what can we learn from this most recent chapter of the US-China rivalry? Crises reveal character. The pandemic showed the strengths and weaknesses of both countries and the dangers of mistrust and division. The tech war and military tensions remind us that competition can quickly turn into confrontation. But there is also hope. Ordinary people, scientists, doctors, and students continue to reach across borders, building bridges even as leaders build walls. The future is uncertain, but it is not yet written. As we look ahead, the choices made by the US and China will shape not just their own destinies, but the fate of the entire world. Will rivalry lead to ruin, or can competition spark new forms of cooperation and progress? Part 8: History, Identity, and the Stories We Tell Ourselves. Friends, did you know that the rivalry between the United States and China isn't just about politics or economics? It's also about memory, pride, and the stories each nation tells itself. To truly understand this rivalry, we have to look deeper into the hearts and minds of two great civilizations. Let's step back from the headlines and look at the bigger picture. The United States and China are not just countries, they are ideas, symbols, and dreams. Each has a unique history, shaped by triumph and trauma, hope and humiliation. For Americans, the story is one of freedom, opportunity, and the belief that anyone can succeed. The US sees itself as a beacon of democracy, a land of innovation, and a force for good in the world. Its national identity is built on the idea of the American dream, that with hard work, anything is possible. For China, the story is different. It is a civilization thousands of years old, proud of its culture, inventions, and resilience. But it is also a nation scarred by a century of humiliation, a time when foreign powers invaded, divided, and exploited the country. For many Chinese, the rise of modern China is not just about wealth or power, it's about restoring dignity and respect. These stories shape how each country sees itself and each other. When the US looks at China, it often sees a rival, a challenger to its values and leadership. When China looks at the US, it sees both a model to learn from and a threat to its sovereignty and dreams. This clash of identities fuels misunderstanding and mistrust. American leaders talk about containing China, while Chinese leaders warn against foreign interference. Each side believes it is defending its way of life, its values, and its future. The rivalry is not just about trade or technology, it's about whose story will shape the 21st century. Let's trace how these identities have shaped the rivalry over time. 19th century, the US, a young nation, looks to China as a vast, mysterious land, both a market and a mission field. China, weakened by internal strife and foreign invasions, sees the West as both a threat and a source of new ideas. Early 20th century, American missionaries and reformers dream of saving China, while Chinese nationalists dream of throwing off foreign control. Both sides misunderstand each other's motives. World War II, the US and China are allies, but the partnership is uneasy. Americans see themselves as liberators, Chinese leaders remember past betrayals. Cold War, the US sees communist China as a threat to freedom, China sees the US as a new imperialist power. Reform era, China learns from the West, but on its own terms. The US hopes China will become more like itself, but China is determined to chart its own path. 21st century, both countries are global giants, but their worldviews remain very different. Each sees the other as both a partner and a potential enemy. But what does this mean for ordinary people? Imagine a Chinese student studying in America. She is proud of her heritage, but also curious about American life. She faces questions about her country's politics, sometimes feeling misunderstood or judged. Yet she also makes friends, learns new ideas, and dreams of building bridges between two worlds. Or picture an American entrepreneur doing business in China. He is excited by the opportunities, but frustrated by the rules and wary of making mistakes. He admires China's energy and ambition, but sometimes feels like an outsider. There are moments of connection, friendships, marriages, collaborations that defy the headlines. But there are also moments of suspicion, fear, and even anger, as each side struggles to understand the other. The consequences of these clashing identities are profound. Misunderstandings can turn into crises. Small disputes can become symbols of something much bigger. When leaders talk past each other, ordinary people pay the price. Yet, there is also hope. The more Americans and Chinese learn about each other's histories, cultures, and dreams, the more they can find common ground. The rivalry does not have to end in conflict. It can also be a source of creativity, innovation, and even friendship. So, what can we learn from the deeper roots of the US-China rivalry? History matters. The stories we tell ourselves shape the choices we make. If we only see each other as threats, we miss the chance to learn, to grow, and to build a better world together. The US and China are both proud, ambitious nations. Their rivalry is real, but so is their potential for cooperation. The future will be shaped not just by leaders and policies, but by the millions of people who cross borders, share ideas, and dream of something more. As we look ahead, let's remember, understanding is the first step to peace. The stories we tell can divide us or bring us together. Friends, the roots of the US-China rivalry run deep, but the branches reach everywhere. The next chapter is being written right now, by leaders and by ordinary people, in every country on Earth. What kind of world do we want to build? That is the question for our time. Thank you for following this journey through history, conflict, and hope. If you found this story meaningful, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think the future holds for the US, China, and the world?